Welcome into the swamp, the Okefenokee swamp that is, or at least as it was brought to life by cartoonist Walt Kelly. I'm Jenny Robb and I'm the curator of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, and we're proud to present this exhibition exploring the social and political satire of Kelly's acclaimed newspaper comic strip, Pogo. At first glance, Pogo was a gentle, funny animal feature about a cute and motley group of swamp critters. A closer look reveals Kelly's pointed political opinions and insightful social commentary throughout the strip's 25-year run from 1948 until 1973. Kelly explored topics from the Cold War and the Red Scare to wiretapping to the environment. I invite you to join me and my co-curator, Lucy Shelton Caswell, on this virtual tour of the exhibition. We'll be joined by some very special guests along the way. First, let's take a look at one of Kelly's most significant influences, George Harriman. Like Pogo, Harriman's comic strip Crazy Cat featured a cast of anthropomorphic animals that lived in an imaginary world based on a real place. In Harriman's case, the characters resided in the desert climate of Coconino County, Arizona. Kelly is considered so far the only cartoonist to rival Harriman's masterful use of poetic language and dialogue. Both strips are celebrated as products of the wildly creative and idiosyncratic visions of their respective creators. Walt Kelly was a versatile cartoonist. Early in his career, he worked as an animator for Walt Disney. After leaving Disney in 1941, Kelly wrote and drew comic book stories for Dell Comics, where he created Pogo Possum and Albert Alligator for the first issue of Animal Comics in 1941. The animals provided comic relief for a black child named Bumbazine. Although Kelly championed progressive political views throughout his career, he employed racist stereotypes and cultural images of minstrelsy and trickster figures that were commonly used at the time, especially in his animation and early comic book work. Kelly retired Bumbazine after issue 12, but transferred many of his problematic characteristics, as well as Bumbazine's role in the stories, to Pogo Possum. In 1948, Kelly joined the liberal New York Star newspaper. Let's hear from my co-curator, Lucy Caswell.
By 1948, Walt Kelly was back on the East Coast working for the New York Star. There he drew editorial cartoons. The paper published Pogo before it was syndicated, and he also did general art direction. The editorial cartoons are particularly interesting because they provide examples of Kelly's concerns about the Red Scare and the civil rights movement that we later see in Pogo.
It was at the Star that Kelly finally found the ideal outlet for his unique humor and opinions in Pogo. Let's take a look at the oldest comic strip in our exhibit here. This strip is from an early storyline that featured residents of the Okefenokee swamp holding a dubious election for sheriff that coincided with the presidential election of 1948. Candidates Pogo Possum, Albert Alligator, and Howlin' Owl used shady tactics to campaign for votes. The votes accidentally catch fire and only one can be read. Owl says, "It say P-O-G-O, that spell owl." Owl is the winner, hot dog. Needless to say, the other candidates disputed these questionable election results. I wonder what Kelly would have done with the most recent 2020 presidential election. Now, in 1952, the next election, Kelly took his satire to another level. Let's hear from Lucy Caswell.
The presidential primaries of 1952 were very contentious, and in the end, Dwight Eisenhower became the Republican candidate, and little tiny "I Like Ike" buttons were produced to encourage people to wear them to support his candidacy. This was too good for Walt Kelly to resist, so he developed the I Go Pogo campaign, where Pogo ran for president. And it took off wildly across college campuses all over the country. And there's a riot at Harvard that we have a newspaper clipping for, and a telegram ordering 100,000 additional I Go Pogo buttons. It was quite the thing in 1952.
Now let's hear from editorial cartoonist Ben Sargent about his love of Pogo and its political satire.
Hi, I'm Ben Sargent, and for 35 years I was editorial cartoonist at the Austin American-Statesman and have been a lifelong fan of Pogo. I've been reading Pogo almost since it first appeared 3 weeks before I was born, and once I became aware of it, from the papers and from the original Red Book collection that my parents had at their house. I instantly loved the characters and the stories and the dialogue. My Aunt Emma, who was a retired school teacher, wouldn't let us read Pogo at her house because she was afraid it would damage our grammar and diction. But most of all, I loved the drawings. Walt Kelly made a wise choice in setting up his strip in a swamp with all the rich visual possibilities of water and plants and sun and shade. But best of all were his trees. If I could ever draw a tree like Walt Kelly, I could die a fulfilled cartoonist. But the true glory of Pogo was its trenchant and unmistakable political commentary. When my friend and colleague Garry Trudeau won the Pulitzer Prize for his openly opinionated strip Doonesbury in 1975, there was much hand-wringing in my profession over the fact that a comic strip couldn't be a political cartoon. That seemed ridiculous to me because Pogo had been a vehicle for some of the best political cartooning in the country at that point for more than 20 years. Walt Kelly created characters, all animals of course, that lampooned political targets from Joe McCarthy to Dick Nixon and Spiro Agnew with incisive wit and wicked glee. So to my mind, Pogo had it all. I'd be hard-pressed to name what's number 2 among American comic strips after the undisputed champion.
Thank you, Ben. Now, Walt Kelly and Garry Trudeau weren't the first or only cartoonists to lampoon elections, so let's hear from Lucy again with some context.
A common complaint from editors and readers is that comic strips should be funny. They shouldn't include anything political. That is simply a mistaken opinion, since politics has been a part of the comic strip since the very beginning. In our exhibit, we have Hogan's Alley featuring the Yellow Kid from 1896, and this is considered the first comic strip. And in this example, the cartoonist Richard Felton Outcalt is talking about the presidential campaign of William McKinley. We go on to Andy Gump running in the 20s for Congress. Barney Google ran for president in the late 20s. In the 80s, Zippy ran for president. And in the 90s, Garry Trudeau ran Duke for president. And in the examples here, we also see a New York City businessman named Donald Trump considering a presidential run.
Throughout the run of Pogo, Kelly continued to use his animal characters to comment on elections and to satirize the shortcomings and absurdities of politicians and our democracy. In this Sunday strip, Kelly manages to comment on Groundhog Day, the Olympics, and the radical idea of a female presidential candidate, which at the time seemed about as likely as a purple cow becoming a candidate. And let's not lose sight of Kelly's amazing artistry, which had a profound effect on a generation of cartoonists, including Jan Eliot, our next special guest, who's the creator of the comic strip Stone Soup.
Hi, I'm Jan Eliot, and I fell in love with the work of Walt Kelly when I was a little girl. I would lay the Sunday Funnies out on the living room floor and stare and stare and stare into the world of the swamp and Pogo and the alligator and Miss Possum. I loved all the characters. I loved everything about it. I could read it, but I don't think I often understood the jokes because they were too adult for me. But it did not matter because I could stare at that world for hours. Walt Kelly's background as an animator made him a wonderful comic strip artist. He had worked for Disney for years. And when I became a cartoonist and I wanted to really perfect my skill, looking at the work of Pogo was one of my ways that I tried to learn and become inspired. I could only hope to be half the cartoonist that Walt Kelly was. Let's take a look at what made a Pogo strip so special. In this strip, focus on the artwork. Walt drew with a brush, creating beautiful flowing lines that give life to his characters. He used heavier lines where there needed to be more weight and shadow, and lighter lines where he just wants to suggest a detail to us. If you look closely, you may see the faint blue lines. He sketched his comic strip first with a blue pencil that doesn't photograph. Look in the middle row, the first panel, and you will see that he worked the position of the cow's head a few times before he was happy with it. Walt was also a master of using black to create interest under the tree root or beneath a cow's hoof, and the tree leaves that frame the word bubble in that same panel. I also love how he drew his frames freely, probably with a dip pen, using the blue pencil as a guide but not a strict rule. In contrast, he was so precise with his lettering. Perfect calligraphy. Even when you don't understand all his references, because they alluded to current events of his day, you can stare for hours at Walt's artwork. Walt Kelly inspired all of us to be better cartoonists. I really hope you enjoy your tour of this exhibit.
Thank you, Jan. Now in this section of the exhibit, you'll see one of Kelly's most colorful characters, the bear, P.T. Bridgeport. He was a frequent visitor to the swamp, especially during election season, and he embodied Kelly's criticism of the carnival-like public spectacle that elections had become in the United States. The character was based, of course, on P.T. Barnum, the famous 19th century circus operator and showman, and his last name is a nod to Kelly's hometown of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Notice how Kelly used lettering reminiscent of 19th century circus posters for P.T. Bridgeport's speech balloons. And here's one of my favorites of Kelly's later strips. It's a criticism of the growing influence of money on presidential campaigns. It was published in April of 1971. Kelly is perhaps best known for skewering Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy made a name for himself by capitalizing on Americans' fears that communists were infiltrating the government and other high-profile professions like the film and the entertainment industries. McCarthy fueled this collective paranoia known as the Red Scare. Now, in 1953, he was appointed chair of the Committee on Government Operations and its investigative subcommittee, where he proceeded to bully witnesses and make unsubstantiated and false accusations that destroyed innocent people's lives and reputations. In response, Kelly introduced Simple J. Malarkey, an obvious caricature of McCarthy as a gun-toting, tyrannical bobcat with a 5 o'clock shadow. Malarkey originally comes to the swamp to help the Audible Boy Birdwatchers Society with its annual bird count, which had run into trouble when Mole Macaroni, which was a nod to prominent anti-communist Senator Pat McCarran, begins insisting that various animals are actually birds, a reference to the witch hunt for communist sympathizers and spies. Malarkey seizes power, changes the name to the Bonfire Boys, and proceeds to intimidate the other members at gunpoint. He eventually threatens to tar and feather all the citizens of the swamp to find out which are really birds. But finally, he falls into the vat of tar himself. He's last seen covered in tar chasing Mole Macaroni through the swamp with an axe. Taking a stand against McCarthy, who was then at the height of his power and influence, was both dangerous and courageous. After all, critics of McCarthy often ended up being accused of being communists themselves, ordered to appear before the committee, and sometimes even blacklisted. It was also a risky thing to do for family newspapers, and some editors responded by either dropping the strip or moving it to the editorial page or actually altering it. In one case, an editor actually had the 5 o'clock shadow from Malarkey removed. In October of 1954, the Providence Bulletin's editor threatened to pull the strip if he saw Malarkey's face in it again. So in subsequent appearances, Kelly put a paper bag over his head, or he hid his face behind speech balloons like you see in this strip. Eventually, McCarthy's tactics were condemned, and he was censured by Congress in 1954. His popularity and influence declined, and he actually died of alcoholism in 1957 at the age of 48. Kelly attended the trial and drew these sketches that reside in our collection. Simple J. Malarkey's cousin, Wile E. Cat, was a bobcat that Kelly used to represent xenophobic hate groups. He smoked a corncob pipe, carried a shotgun, and generally behaved in a threatening and menacing way towards the other swamp residents. Now, like his cousin, he accused anyone who disagreed with him of being a communist. So let's hear more about this comic strip from 1958 from CNN anchor and comic strip aficionado Jake Tapper.
Hi, I'm Jake Tapper, CNN anchor and longtime fan of Pogo Possum and Walt Kelly. I first learned of the Okefenokee Swamp and Pogo and Albert and all the others at my grandparents' house in North Carolina They loved Pogo. They loved Deck Us All with Boston Charlie. And it was revelatory when I found in the attic a box full of Pogo paperbacks and even some of those comic books from the early 50s. And I just loved getting lost in the silliness and craziness of the animals in the swamp and the politics of it all as well. I think I learned who Simple J. Malarkey was before I learned who Senator Joe McCarthy was. You know, you then find out, well, there's really a real person who inspired this evil creature. And, you know, I loved the politics in Pogo. Some people preferred the versions, the strips that didn't have the politics, but I love it. I love the dog that looks like Spiro Agnew and the bulldog that looks like J. Edgar Hoover and the like, Simple J. Malarkey. I have some originals, including a steer rather, that looks like President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson. The strip you're looking at from 1958 is inspired by real events. After the Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of schools, the Democratic governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, a segregationist, responded by closing all the schools. So in this series of strips by Walt Kelly, which was very controversial at the time, and some newspapers even censored them, you have these, you know, kind of secret schools cropping up all over the Okefenokee Swamp, and you have a bunch of the more ignorant animals, like Wile E. Cat in this strip, talking about how 1 + 1 = 11. Once again, the adults demonstrating their ignorance, a lesson that we saw play out in 1958, we see play out today. And once again, Walt Kelly was on the side of the angels.
Kelly delighted in skewering the boogeymen of the Cold War, like Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro. Now let's hear from Garry Trudeau about this storyline that featured Khrushchev and Castro plotting to destroy the U.S. economy.
Hi, I'm Garry Trudeau. This is one of my very favorite Pogo strips in the collection because so much of what made Walt Kelly distinctive is present here. The unparalleled draftsmanship honed during his time at Disney, the jazzy, unpredictable dialogue, and the devastating caricatures, such as the canine Castro and the porcine Khrushchev we see here. Uncanny likenesses of world leaders trapped in the bodies of humble farm animals. In this strip, the two cunning communists discuss an inane plot to disrupt the capitalist financial system by flooding the marketplace with counterfeit stamps. Kelly was commenting on the trading stamp craze that had spread across the country. The most famous of these stamps were called green stamps. Kelly's were called puce stamps, and he actually made them available in blocks of 9 to the public. The fake stamps were a gentle send-up of what Kelly obviously regarded as a scam. But having said that, I should add that the beauty of Kelly's whimsical social satire is it really didn't matter if you knew what he was up to. His delightfully unhinged characters were so entertaining in their own right that they were fun to follow, even if you didn't know they were brilliant parodies. Kelly worked on multiple levels, leaving no one out of the fun.
Thank you, Garry. This exhibit is drawn entirely from the collections of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum, and it mostly features work from our Walt Kelly and Pogo collections, which we acquired from Selby Kelly, and also works from Garry Trudeau's personal collection, which he donated to the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum in 2020. Kelly made Vice President Spiro Agnew the focus of a long storyline in 1970. Agnew was known as the Law and Order Republican, and he was caricatured as a hyena in full military regalia, which was a spoof of the new uniforms for the White House Guards introduced at Nixon's behest in January 1970. Kelly was a constant critic of the federal government's unjust domestic surveillance and spying on its own citizens by the CIA, the FBI, and other government entities. Kelly mocked FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, shown as a bulldog from the FYI, wearing an overcoat and fedora, as well as Attorney General John Mitchell, who advocated for the use of wiretaps without court authorization. He's depicted as a pipe-smoking eagle. Walt Kelly's most famous phrase first appeared in the foreword of the Pogo Papers, published in 1953, We shall meet the enemy, and not only may he be ours, he may be us. It was a parody of a message sent from naval officer Oliver Perry after defeating the British Royal Navy in the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812. Perry's message read, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Kelly later shortened his version to "We have met the enemy, and he is us," something he used for an Earth Day poster, and later in this special strip that accompanied an editorial Kelly wrote for Earth Day, 1971. Our exhibit also features some animation artwork from the 1970 animated feature We Have Met the Enemy, and He Is Us. It was produced by Walt Kelly and his wife, Selby Kelly, who was also an animator. Kelly's characters were animated, and they were also brought to life in 3 dimensions. Let's hear from Lucy Caswell.
In the late 1960s, 2 little boys who lived in Worthington, Ohio, bugged their mothers to buy Biz detergent because they were Pogo fans, and all of the major Pogo characters were featured giveaways in boxes of Biz detergent. These boys donated these materials to the library in 1988. The 2 boys grew up to be Jim Camerad, who worked for Disney as an animator for many years, and he was head story for the recent Peanuts movie. And the other boy, his friend, is Jeff Smith, creator of Bone, Wrestle, and Tukey.
Hi, I'm Jeff Smith. The first time I saw Walt Kelly, the first time I really saw Walt Kelly, I was 9 years old, and a little girl from my class brought a copy of a Pogo book from her father's collection into school. It was called Prehistorical Pogo in Pandemonia, and I went nuts. I'd never seen such a thick, fantastic comic book in my whole life. It immediately became my life's goal. The artwork was beautiful, the characters had weight, the line drawing was very lush, the words the characters spoke. As soon as you cracked that Walt Kelly code, you just went on this fantastic merry-go-round ride through some kind of Lewis and Carroll world of the swamp. I loved it, but perhaps the most significant aspect of Walt Kelly and his career, for me personally as a cartoonist, was the fact that he owned his artwork. It was a copyright at the end of every strip. Copyright 1957, Walt Kelly. He owned it. And now, when I went to sell Bone to the syndicates, I insisted I will own the copyright as well. And of course, that was a deal breaker. However, thank you, Walt. That worked out very well for me. The second thing were the Pogo books themselves. I always wanted to collect Bone into these trade paperbacks, which is what the industry referred to them as back in the 90s. People were starting to call them graphic novels around that time. I never did. I always called them my Pogo books. Thanks.
Now let's hear from another comic strip creator who was influenced by Walt Kelly at a young age, Lynn Johnston, the creator of For Better or For Worse.
Hi, I'm Lynn Johnston. I did a comic strip for a long time called For Better for Worse, and I'm here in my studio in my little apartment. And you asked how Pogo had influenced me, and I guess I was maybe 6, 8 years old, and Walt Kelly was a name that I knew because I would always read the names of the artists at the bottom of the comic strip. So for some reason that was always important to me. And my grandfather was one of these people who analyzed the gags in the comics and whether it made sense or if the story carried on in a way that you could follow it easily. He was very critical, and my dad loved to look at the artwork. So I had 2 men in my lives. Both of them were very smart, very knowledgeable people, and both of them loved comics for different reasons. My dad loved the art and the gags, and my grandfather just wanted to criticize anything, including me. But it was the only time we got along. Anyways, I would sit on his lap, we would read the newspaper comics together, and Pogo was something that really affected me because I loved the art. I didn't understand the gags because it was political and I was too young to understand the gags. But what I did understand was the beauty of the artwork. And of course, like Charles Schultz and a lot of the folks at Mad Magazine, I never expected to meet the author. And years and years later, when I joined the National Cartoonist Society, one of the first women cartoonists I met through Bunny Host and others was Selby Kelly. And I told her how much I loved Pogo and how excited I was to meet her. And she told me that she had all of Walt's work. She had collected everything and she had it there at her home. And I was a brand new cartoonist. For Better For Worse had just started to come out. And I had the audacity to ask her if I could trade her an original of For Better For Worse for an original Pogo. And she agreed, which was mind-boggling. Anyways, and my work wasn't that good. And I have on my wall here the one that she gave me, and I'm going to turn this around and show it to you. Okay, so here on my wall is the original Pogo, and it's right, let me just back up a little bit. It's right where I work. This is where I write. This is where I sit and have coffee in the morning. This is my little space here. I have a painting studio in another building. I can walk down there. But this is where I do a lot of my work. And this is right on my wall, right next to where I work. And it's a beauty. And stuck in the painting, in the artwork is, you know, just stuff that's important to me. And look at this beautiful, beautiful original Walt Kelly. It's got all of the characters. Selby was just wonderful to give this to me. The blue line on there, isn't that fabulous? Anyways, so there you go. So yes, I learned a lot from Walt Kelly. I learned that that this beautiful fine art technique is something that is really worth doing. It's time consuming. It looks like he did everything with a brush. And look at this blue line. You can see everything here. And yes, he influenced me, and I am very grateful for his work and for his genius, and for Selby Kelly, who was kind enough to give me this beautiful piece.
And finally, let's turn to Bill Watterson, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes, who's featured in our legacy section along with Jeff Smith, Jeff McNelly, and Garry Trudeau.
Pogo was an enormous influence on me when I was growing up, but now I see it very much as a strip of a different era, and I wonder what young cartoonists make of it today. Even when I was a kid, the strip's visual density was unusual. Most humor strips by that time had followed Peanuts to a cleaner, more minimal look. All the white space of those strips attracts the eye, and the simpler art was better suited to the comics' ever-shrinking newspaper space. In comparison, Pogo looked almost like Steve Canyon or a continuity strip. Lots of black, lush detail, and it's packed with words. But once I got acclimated, the artwork was a huge pull on me. The strip has a very sensuous brush line. It's full of lively animation and expressive characterization. Pogo has a visual exuberance that few other strips have. As with the drawing, the writing requires a bit of investment on the reader's part. You have to read it for a while to get the spirit of it, because the humor wasn't so much in the punchlines as in the spiraling diversions that pass for plots, the invented dialect, the ludicrous conversations of mutual misunderstanding. You need highly individualized, vivid characters to pull that off, and I learned a lot from that. Unlike a setup and gag, a true back-and-forth conversation makes all the panels funny. Comic strips can work pretty well for expressing an overall political outlook. You think of Little Orphan Annie or Dick Tracy or Little Abner. They all had strong worldviews. But comic strips were never built for commenting on day-to-day politics. For starters, back when everything was drawn on paper and mailed in, edited, engraved, printed, newspaper comics had to be drawn a month in advance, so it was impossible for a strip to keep up with changing events. More than that, editors didn't want controversy in the so-called funnies, and they still don't. To be successful, a comic strip has to appear in hundreds of newspapers, and we tend to think of the large metropolitan dailies, but back when newspapers were thriving, a lot of newspapers were small cities, rural towns, so it's not a cutting-edge market. Newspaper comics are about as mainstream an art as you can get, which is actually one of the things I love most about them. But they survive by appealing to everyone, so a certain middle-of-the-road predictability is the ticket to a good career. Dagwood can collide with a mailman for a century. Interesting thoughts are a bonus, but partisan punditry will get you dropped. So Pogo's political commentary was necessarily of a different sort than today's instantaneous, hyper-partisan snark. In Pogo, the political figures were presented as characters, and the issues took the forms of more of stories and allegories. Even then, Walt Kelly would reportedly draw a second set of innocuous strips that a nervous editor could substitute for less controversial reading. Doonesbury turned a lot of those expectations upside down in the 1970s by working on a crazy tight schedule turnaround and sharpening the commentary. Garry Trudeau changed the kind of satire that comic strips were capable of doing, and Pogo no longer looks as edgy as it did at the time. But in terms of the beauty and the full employment of the comic strip medium, that's rarely been equaled. I think Pogo is a high watermark of the art form. So I hope it finds new audiences going forward. There's a lot of young cartoonists can learn from it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this virtual tour of our Pogo exhibit. I also want to say special thanks to my co-curator, Lucy Caswell, as well as all of our special guests. And now a parting message from Walt Kelly. If you can't vote my way, vote anyway. Just vote.